What does it take to make an emperor leave his throne for the first time in 200 years? Not a war, not a treaty, not the birth of an heir or the death of a rival or the collapse of a trade route that fed 400 billion mouths across 11,000 worlds. A man. One man on one forgotten rock at the edge of charted space, who never held a title, never commanded a fleet, and never once asked for anything in return. They told the emperor's court he was dead. The records said so. The pension office had stopped sending payments 80 years ago, filed under presumed deceased, no next of kin. And yet, on a gray morning in the 203rd year of the Kaelen Ascendancy, an emperor who had not set foot outside his home system since his coronation stepped onto a transport meant for cargo, not kings, and told his advisors he was going to find out for himself. This is the story of why. Sit with it. It takes its time getting there, and it is meant to. 211 years before that gray morning, a war that history would later call brief, because history is written by the people who survive it, and brief is a word survivors use to make their nightmares smaller, was in its ugliest month. The Kaelen Ascendancy and the human colonies of the Perseus Reach had been trading fire for 11 weeks, and neither side had yet learned the shape of the other's mercy, because neither side had shown any. The Kaelen were tall, silver-skinned, built for cold worlds and long patience, and they had never lost a war in 800 years of recorded conflict. Their military doctrine had been refined across a dozen conquered systems and had never once required them to consider the possibility of failure. They did not expect to lose this one either. Their admirals spoke of the human colonies, the way a glacier might speak of a candle, if glaciers were capable of contempt. What they had not accounted for was a species that had spent its entire violent, magnificent history learning how to keep fighting after every reasonable calculation said it should stop. Humanity did not have superior ships in that war. It did not have superior numbers, superior technology, or superior strategy in any way a Kaelen tactical computer could measure. What it had, in the words of one exhausted Kaelen fleet commander recorded in a private log 3 weeks before the armistice, was an unwillingness to accept the mathematics of their own defeat, which I confess I no longer know how to counter. On a Kaelen troop carrier called the Ancestral Voice, drifting crippled in the debris field above a moon that would later be renamed in a language neither species had yet invented, a 14-year-old boy was dying, slowly, in the dark, listening to the metal around him groan under pressures it was never built to survive. His name was Threll Vantriss Kaelen, third in line to a throne that, on that particular night, seemed unlikely to still exist by morning. He was aboard the carrier not because he had chosen to be. Royal children were kept far from battle as a matter of strict, ancient policy, but because the diplomatic shuttle evacuating him from a border posting had been shot down over contested space 3 days earlier, and the Ancestral Voice, the nearest vessel capable of retrieving survivors, had taken him aboard only to be crippled itself less than 6 hours later by a human strike wing that had no idea, and would not have cared if it had known, that a royal child was somewhere inside the hull it was tearing apart. What remained of the carrier's crew spent that night trying to keep a hole in the hull from killing everyone inside it before help arrived, if there was anyone left on either side who still wanted to send it. Communications were down. Half the crew was already dead. The boy did not understand, in the way a 14-year-old cannot fully understand such things even when told plainly, that the adults responsible for protecting him were themselves running out of time. Sergeant Elias Warren of the 3rd Human Expeditionary Corps did not know any of this when he and 4 other soldiers boarded the wreck at dawn ship time, moving through corridors lit only by emergency strips and the occasional shower of sparks from a conduit that hadn't yet finished dying. He knew only that command had ordered the carrier searched for intelligence and survivors eliminated, because the Ancestral Voice had, 6 days earlier, been part of the formation that killed 19 human soldiers in an ambush over a refueling station, and the men walking those corridors with him had lost friends in that ambush. Grief in a war does not stay grief for long. It curdles fast into something that wants a target, something that can be pointed and fired and used to make the hollow feeling in a person's chest go away, at least for a few minutes. Elias had watched it happen to better men than the ones walking beside him now. He had felt it a penning more than once inside himself, and had learned, through some combination of discipline and stubbornness, he could never fully explain even to himself, how to recognize the feeling and set it down before it set fire to something he couldn't take back. They found the boy in a maintenance alcove 3 decks down, curled against a bulkhead, a Kaelen medical officer's body between him and the door, already cold. The medical officer had used the last minutes of her life dragging him there, and had died shielding him with nothing but her own body and a conviction that someone, someday, might still choose to be decent, even in a war that had given almost no one on either side much reason to believe it. The soldier beside Elias, a corporal named Des Akafer, 22 years old, who had watched his bunkmate die in the refueling station ambush, and had not slept a full night since, raised his weapon. Elias put his hand on the barrel and pushed it down. "He's a kid," Elias said. His voice did not rise. It rarely did. That was, in later years, the detail people found hardest to believe, that history had turned on a man who spoke quietly even when everything around him was screaming, even when the deck was still shuddering underfoot and the air recyclers were failing, and every instinct in the room was pulling toward violence like water toward a drain. "He's Kaelen," Akafer said, as if that settled it, and in the arithmetic of that war, for most people on both sides it did. "You know what they did to Reyes. You saw the footage." "I saw it," Elias said. "This isn't him." "Doesn't matter whose face is under the helmet, Sarge. They're all." "Look at his hands," Elias said, cutting him off, not with anger but with the same flat patience he might have used to point out a hazard on the deck. "Before you decide what he is, look at his hands." They looked. The boy's hands, still gripping the edge of the dead officer's uniform, were unmistakably a child's hands. Long-fingered, silver, and shaking so hard the motion had become visible even through the boy's attempt to hold still, to make himself small, to disappear into the wall behind him, the way frightened children of every species instinctively try to do. Elias knelt. He did not raise his own weapon and did not lower it in some grand gesture either. He simply set it on the deck plating, out of easy reach of everyone, including himself, and held up 2 empty hands. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, and it did not matter that the boy did not speak standard English yet, because some sentences carry their meaning in the tone that delivers them, and every species that has ever raised a child recognizes the sound of an adult trying to be safe. What happened next took 4 minutes. Command would later dispute the exact timeline in 3 separate hearings, but 4 minutes is what the black box recovered from the carrier confirmed. 4 minutes in which Sergeant Elias Warren argued, ordered, and eventually physically placed himself between 4 armed men and a 14-year-old boy who was not a combatant, was not a target, and was, by any definition that mattered, still a child clinging to a dead woman's coat. "Command's orders were clear," said a private named Eiko Tanaka, the youngest of the group, her voice tight with something that was not quite anger and not quite fear. "No survivors. No prisoners. You want to explain to the Co why we've got a live royal in custody instead of a body count?" "I'll explain it," Elias said. "You won't have to." "That's not how this works, Sarge, and you know it." "Then it's about to start working that way," Elias said, and something in his tone, flat, immovable, entirely without the tremor of a man bluffing, made even Akafer hesitate. He did not win that argument because he outranked anyone. A sergeant's authority in that moment carried barely more weight than any other voice in the room, and everyone there knew it. He did not win it because he was the strongest or the loudest, and he was neither. He won it in the end because he told them that if they wanted to shoot the boy, they would have to shoot him first, and he said it in a voice so level, so entirely without theater, that the other men understood he meant it exactly as stated, and something in each of them, something that the war had not yet managed to burn all the way out, no matter how hard it had tried, recognized that this was a line none of them actually wanted to be the one to cross. "You'd really do that," Tanaka said quietly, "over a Kaelen kid?" "I'd do it over any kid," Elias said. "That's the whole point, Private. If it stops being true the second the face changes, it was never actually true to begin with." Nobody answered that. Nobody had to. The four of them stood there a moment longer in the failing light, the ship groaning around them, the boys ragged, breathing the only other sound in the alcove, and then, one by one, the weapons came down. They left. The boy alive. They tagged him for evacuation as a non-combatant, filed the incident report, and moved on to the next corridor, because there was still a war happening around them, and grief does not wait politely for its targets. Elias Warren carried Threll Vantriss Kaelen out of that wreck himself, wrapped in a thermal blanket meant for a human twice the boy's size, and did not let go of him until a Kaelen evacuation shuttle, under a flag of temporary armistice arranged specifically for this exchange, came to take him home. The boy said one word before the shuttle doors closed. Later, historians on both sides would spend considerable effort trying to translate it precisely, because the Kaelen language carries formal and informal registers the way human languages carry tenses, and the word the boy used was not the informal thanks a child gives a stranger for a small kindness. It was the word used in Kaelen tradition to mark a debt that outlives the person who incurs it, a word reserved, historically, for moments when a life has been given back that was not, by any reasonable expectation, owed. Elias did not know that at the time. He thought it just meant thank you. He was wrong, and the difference between those two meanings would take 200 years to fully arrive. The court-martial happened 4 months later, in a gray administrative building on a gray administrative world, in a room with no windows, and a panel of 5 officers who had not been present for a single second of what had actually happened aboard the ancestral voice. Command did not care that a 14-year-old had been spared. Command cared that a sergeant had disobeyed a direct order in a combat zone, had endangered his unit by delaying an active clearance operation, and had, in the words of the prosecuting officer, extended mercy to the enemy at the expense of military discipline, unit cohesion, and the chain of command upon which every soldier's safety ultimately depends. The fact that the war ended 11 weeks after the incident, in part because the sparing of that particular boy became, through channels that took years to become public, a small but genuine crack in the wall of mutual dehumanization that had made the war possible in the first place. None of that mattered to a tribunal looking at a technical violation of a wartime order. Akafor testified. So did Tanaka. Both of them, to their credit, testified honestly, describing exactly what had happened and exactly what Elias had said, and neither of them softened it or dressed it up as anything other than what it was. A sergeant refusing an order he considered morally indefensible in the middle of a war zone at genuine personal risk. "Would you say Sergeant Warren endangered the unit?" the prosecutor asked Akafor. Akafor was quiet for a long moment. "No, sir," he said finally. "I'd say he probably saved something in all of us that the war was trying pretty hard to take." It was not the kind of answer that moves tribunals, and it did not. When Elias was finally asked to speak in his own defense, he did not offer excuses, did not cite regulations, did not attempt to argue that his actions had, in the long run, contributed to ending the war faster than continued brutality would have. He said only, "Because he was a child, and I wasn't going to be the kind of man who could live with what came after if I didn't stop it. I understand the order I disobeyed. I understood it at the time. I'd disobey it again, exactly the same way, exactly as many times as I needed to." It was not the kind of statement that moves tribunals. It moved almost no one in that room. He was stripped of rank, dishonorably discharged, and because the peace that followed the war was fragile and the returning public wanted heroes who looked like conquerors, not soldiers who had shown restraint toward the species they just finished fighting, quietly relocated, at his own request, to a frontier settlement 3 jumps beyond the reach of easy news. He did not ask for a pension. He did not ask for anything. He asked only to be left alone, and for 2 centuries mostly he was. What almost no one on either side knew, what would not become public until the morning the Emperor stepped off that cargo transport, was that Elias Warren had not been forgotten. Not by everyone. Threll Vantriss Kaelen grew up. That is a simple sentence for a complicated process, because growing up as third in line to a throne, in the shadow of a war his own species had started and nearly lost its soul finishing, meant growing up with a very specific memory lodged somewhere just beneath his ribs, the memory of 4 minutes in a maintenance alcove, a dead woman's coat, and a stranger's quiet, unshakable voice telling 4 armed men that he would have to die before the boy did. He was not, in the years that followed, meant to inherit the throne at all. 2 elder siblings stood ahead of him in the succession, and for most of his early adulthood he was permitted the relative freedom of a royal who was not expected to rule. He studied history, then medicine, then, briefly and to his family's mild bemusement, the philosophy of restorative justice on conquered worlds, a subject the Ascendancy had, until his generation, shown almost no institutional interest in whatsoever. A plague took his eldest sibling at 40. A shuttle accident took the second at 61. Threll ascended to the throne at the age of 74, young, by Kaelen standards, and entirely unprepared by his own private admission to Vosuk, his newly appointed attendant, on the night before his coronation. "I do not know how to be an emperor," he confessed. "I know how to be grateful. I am not certain those are the same skill." "They may be closer than you think, Your Majesty," Vosuk said. He told the story of the ancestral voice exactly once in public, decades later, during his coronation address, and even then he told it without names, because he had learned by then that some debts are too large to be discussed casually, and he did not yet know if the man who had incurred this one on his behalf was even alive to be embarrassed by the attention. "There was a soldier," he said, to a court hall of 11,000 delegates representing every world under Kaelen governance, his voice carrying farther than he had ever intended it to, "who was ordered to end my life, and chose instead to end the war inside himself that would have let him do it. I do not know if he understood, in that moment, that he had also chosen the shape of everything I would become. I intend to spend the rest of my reign proving that his choice mattered." He kept that promise in ways large and small. The Ascendancy's post-war doctrine toward human colonies, unusually generous by the standards of interspecies conflict resolution at the time, bore his fingerprints throughout. Where his predecessors had annexed conquered territories outright, he proposed shared governance councils. Where military tradition called for garrisons in occupied space, he withdrew them within a decade and replaced them with trade envoys. Where the old doctrine had treated defeated enemies as resources to be managed, he insisted, against considerable resistance from his own generals, on treating them as partners to be persuaded. Historians would later note with some surprise that an empire which had never lost a war in 8 centuries chose, in its first true test of victory, restraint over domination, curiosity over conquest, partnership over subjugation. They called it strategic wisdom. They called it enlightened self-interest. They rarely called it what it actually was, which was one boy's memory of one man's mercy, scaled up across a civilization until it became policy, then law, then, eventually, simply the way things were done, so thoroughly absorbed into Ascendancy culture that later generations would struggle to imagine it had ever been otherwise. The reaction to that coronation address was not universally warm. There were generals in that hall, veterans of the war who had lost brothers and daughters and lifelong friends to human weapons, who heard their new emperor speak of mercy toward the very species that had cost them everything, and who left the ceremony with their jaws set and their opinions unchanged. One elder statesman, a war hero named Marshal Devrick Thane, who had commanded the Kaelen fleet during the worst of the fighting, requested a private audience within the week. "You speak of a debt to a human soldier," Thane said, once the doors had closed and it was only the two of them in the receiving chamber. "I understand gratitude, Your Majesty. I do not understand policy built upon it. An empire cannot be governed by the memory of a single kindness, however sincerely felt." "No," the emperor agreed. "It cannot be governed by memory alone. But policy has to start somewhere, Marshal, and I have found that the policies built on cruelty require constant maintenance. More force, more garrisons, more fear forever, because fear never actually settles anything, it only postpones the reckoning. I would rather build something that does not need to be defended quite so exhaustingly. And if it fails, if the humans use your restraint against us, then I will have been wrong," the emperor said, "and I will answer for it. But I would rather be wrong having tried the harder, more honest path than be right having built my reign on the same doctrine that nearly cost me my life at 14 years old, delivered by my own side, aboard my own ship, from officers who would have executed me as easily as any human soldier might have, had circumstances been reversed." Thane had no answer for that. He left the audience unconvinced by his own later account, but not unmoved, and within a decade would become, somewhat to his own private embarrassment, one of the strongest voices in the Council for Continued Integration Policy, not B. Because he had softened on humanity, he insisted whenever asked, but because the numbers, the actual outcomes across those years, had simply proven his emperor right more often than they had proven him right. It was not the last such conversation the emperor would have. Across the early decades of his reign, he fought patiently, persistently, without ever raising his voice in the way his generals expected a ruler defending his legacy to raise it, for every incremental step of the peace he was building. He vetoed retaliatory strikes twice in his first 15 years, over the furious objection of his own military command, when human colonial militias, still bitter over wartime losses, staged provocations along the border. He personally negotiated the first joint research charter between Kaelen and human scientists, a document so unprecedented at the time that 3 separate ministries refused to sign it until he threatened, quietly and only once, to sign it himself and let the Council explain to 11,000 worlds why their own ministries would not. "You spend more effort defending a debt to one dead soldier than you spend defending your own throne," Vosek observed once, decades into the reign, not as criticism but as simple observation. "He is not dead," the emperor said, "and even if he were, I do not think the debt would end there. I think some debts, once large enough, stop being about the person who is owed and become instead about the kind of person you intend to be for everyone else who comes after them." And quietly, without ever using his own name or title, the new emperor arranged, through intermediaries so carefully layered that even his closest advisors did not know the full chain, for a certain retired human sergeant on a certain frontier world to receive, folded into his water supply and administered so gradually, it registered only as unusually good health for a man of his age, a longevity treatment developed from Kaelen medical science. It was not a cure for death. Nothing is. But it slowed the wearing of a body against time by nearly a factor of 3, and it had been developed in the official Ascendancy Medical Archive, under a project name that translated loosely as the debt that does not age. Elias Warren never knew. For 180 years he simply lived, fished the cold rivers of a colony world called Halden's Rest, taught the settlement's children how to read weather in cloud shapes, built a small boat by hand that he never once sold despite 3 separate offers, buried 2 wives, outlived 3 generations of neighbors, and grew, without understanding why, old far more slowly than a man his age should have. He assumed it was luck, or clean living, or simply the good fortune of a mild climate and a quiet life. He was, in every sense that mattered to him, an unremarkable man who had done one difficult thing a very long time ago, and had spent the rest of his life trying not to think about what it cost him. He was wrong about the not thinking. He thought about it every day. He simply never told anyone, not his first wife, who suspected there was a war story buried somewhere behind his eyes and never pressed for it. Not his second, who found the discharge papers once, folded into the bottom of an old trunk, and asked only once gently whether he wanted to talk about it, and accepted his silence as an answer worth respecting. Not his children, who grew up knowing their father as a quiet, steady man who never raised his voice and never explained why. The settlement itself came to know him, over those long decades, not as a soldier at all but simply as old Elias, the man who could read a coming storm 3 days out from the color at the edge of the sky, who taught half the settlement's children to swim in the cold shallows of the river, and every one of them to respect how quickly that same river could turn dangerous once the spring melt came down from the highlands. He served 2 terms on the settlement council, reluctantly, because no one else wanted the tedious work of arguing over irrigation rights and grain storage, and was known, in that role, for a particular habit that outlasted him in local memory long after his name might otherwise have faded. He never once, in either term, cast a vote before first asking whether the decision would fall hardest on whoever in the room had the least power to object to it. "You'd have made a fine judge," his second wife told him once, watching him mediate a dispute between 2 farming families over a shared well, with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything. "I was a soldier," he said. "Soldiers who have seen the wrong kind of decision made in a hurry tend to slow down a great deal once they're given the choice." He never elaborated further, and she, like everyone else in his long life, learned not to ask. It was only very late in his final years, sitting on that same porch with grandchildren who had grown bold enough to oppress where their parents never had, that he allowed himself occasionally the smallest fragments of the story, never the whole of it, never enough to explain the shape of the debt that had, unknown to him, been quietly repaying itself into his blood and his lungs and his stubbornly persistent heart for nearly 2 centuries, but enough, at least, for his grandchildren to understand that their grandfather's stillness had been earned somewhere, on some deck, in some year none of them had been alive to witness. "Did you kill anyone in the war, Grandpa?" one of them asked him once, with the blunt, fearless curiosity of a child who has not yet learned which questions are supposed to be difficult. Elias considered the question with his usual care. "I did," he said, "and I've made my peace with the parts of that I had to make peace with, but the thing I think about most when I think about the war at all isn't any of that. It's the one time I got to choose not to. I think that's the part worth remembering if you're going to remember any of it, not what I did, what I refused to do." The Emperor was 231 years old when he made his decision, which, for a Kaelen, a species whose natural lifespan ran nearly 4 centuries, placed him solidly in what his own culture considered late middle age, wise but not yet weary, powerful but beginning, for the first time, to feel the particular ache of a life spent almost entirely in service to people he would never personally meet. He had ruled for 2 centuries. He had overseen the integration of the human colonies into full ascendancy partnership, a process so successful that the 2 species now shared research stations, trade routes, and in the newest generations, children born to parents of both species, a thing considered biologically improbable until ascendancy medicine had, decades earlier, made it simply another quiet fact of galactic life. He had buried his own parents, his siblings, 3 wives of his own, and had watched, with the peculiar grief of the very long-lived, as an entire human generation who remembered the war as living memory aged and passed away, replaced by descendants who knew it only as a chapter in a history text, footnoted, debated by scholars, gradually softened by the distance of time into something closer to legend than memory. And still, every year, on the anniversary of a battle whose name most of his own court had stopped commemorating, he asked the same question of his intelligence division. Is he still alive? For 200 years, the answer had been yes. On the morning that changed, the answer was different. The report read simply, Subject Warren, Elias, age approximately 231 standard years, health declining. Cardiac degradation consistent with terminal senescence. Estimated remaining lifespan, under 6 months. The Emperor read the report twice. Then he stood, walked to the window of a palace he had occupied for 2 centuries without ever once leaving the home system it orbited, and made a decision that would break a protocol older than the throne itself. Prepare a transport, he told the aide who had delivered the report. Not a state vessel, something small, something that will not announce itself. Your Majesty, the Council will require. The Council, the Emperor said, in the same level, unhurried tone that history, though he did not yet know it, had inherited from a human sergeant he had met for exactly 4 minutes 2 centuries earlier, will manage without me for 3 weeks. I have managed without them for 200 years on this particular matter. I do not intend to ask permission now. The council, when they learned of it, after he had already departed, by design, reacted with the particular alarm of men and women who had spent 2 centuries watching their emperor never once take an unnecessary risk with his own safety. Vosek, by then nearly as old as the emperor himself, and long past the age of easy surprise, was the only member of the inner circle who was not shocked. I have been waiting for this for 150 years, he told the assembled ministers, with the particular calm of a man who had, in fact, quietly begun preparing contingencies for exactly this scenario decades earlier. I am only surprised it took him this long. The journey took 19 days. He traveled aboard a converted cargo hauler, registered under a false manifest, with a crew of 6 who had been sworn to a silence so absolute that 2 of them would later admit they had assumed, for most of the trip, that they were transporting something illegal rather than someone royal. The Emperor spent much of the journey in the cramped forward cabin, reviewing, for perhaps the 1000th time in 2 centuries, the single surviving photograph the Ascendancy archives held of Sergeant Elias Warren, a grainy image taken during in processing, decades before the war, of a young man with tired eyes and the particular stillness of someone who has already decided, long before anyone asks him to, what kind of person he intends to be. He thought during those 19 days about what he would say. He was, by that point in his reign, considered one of the great orators of his generation, a ruler whose coronation address was still taught in ascendancy schools, whose treaties were studied for the precision and warmth of their language, whose eulogies for fallen dignitaries had, on more than one occasion, been credited with preventing further conflict simply through the force of their sincerity. He had given speeches to parliaments, to grieving worlds, to the assembled delegations of species who had once been enemies, and were now, because of choices he had made, something closer to family. He could not, for 19 days, think of a single sentence adequate to the man he was going to see. On the 18th day, Vosek, who had insisted, against the Emperor's initial objection on accompanying him, found him standing alone in the cargo bay, staring at nothing. You have written and discarded 11 different speeches, Your Majesty, Vosek said. I have read the drafts. They are, if I may say so, magnificent. They are wrong, the Emperor said, every one of them. Wrong how? The Emperor was quiet for a long moment. Outside the small viewport, the stars smeared past at a speed that made them look, briefly, like a single continuous thread of light, a fitting image, he thought later, for 200 years condensed into 19 days. Because he did not save my life with a speech, he said finally. He did it with 4 minutes and an empty pair of hands, I think perhaps that is the only language this conversation actually requires. Then perhaps, Vosik said gently, you should stop trying to write one. Halden's Rest was a small colony, unremarkable by the standards of a galaxy that had, by then, catalogued nearly 40,000 inhabited worlds. It had one modest spaceport, a scattering of farming communities along 3 river valleys, and a population that had, over 2 centuries, become so thoroughly accustomed to being forgotten by the wider galaxy that the arrival of an unmarked Kaelen vessel caused considerably more alarm than excitement. Children ran to tell their parents. Parents ran to tell the settlement's single, elderly administrator, who had not fielded an off-world inquiry in over a decade and had no idea what protocol required. The emperor disembarked alone. He wore no crown, no insignia, nothing that marked him as anything other than an elderly Kaelen in a plain gray traveling coat, and he walked the 2 kilometers from the spaceport to the small riverside house indicated in his intelligence report on foot, because some journeys, he had decided somewhere around day 14, should not be shortened by convenience. The house was modest, timber and local stone, weathered by 200 years of river winters, with a porch that faced east toward the water and a garden gone slightly wild in the way gardens do, when the person tending them has begun, quietly, to run out of time to keep up with them. A hand-built boat sat under a linta beside the house, its hull silvered with age, clearly unused for years, but just as clearly never allowed to fall into ruin. An old man sat on the porch in a wooden chair, a blanket over his knees despite the mild afternoon, watching the river the way people watch things they have watched for so long that the watching itself has become a kind of conversation. The emperor stopped at the base of the porch steps. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Elias Warren's eyes pale, the way very old human eyes sometimes become, as if the color itself has begun to thin, moved over the stranger before him without any particular urgency. He had lived long enough to have stopped being startled by strangers on his porch. The settlement was small, and news of the ship's arrival had likely already reached him through the general murmur that traveled fast in places where nothing much happened. "You've come a long way to look at an old man's garden," Elias said. His voice, though thinner than it had been 2 centuries earlier, carried the same unhurried quality it always had. Time had taken volume from it. It had not taken its stillness. "I have," the emperor said. Something in the tone made the old man go quiet. He studied the visitor more closely now, the silver skin gone pale gray with age, the height slightly stooped, the eyes that held, beneath their evident weariness, something searching and careful and unmistakably afraid. "I know that voice," Elias said slowly. "I don't know how I know it, but I know it." "You should not," the emperor said. "You heard it for perhaps 30 seconds, 211 years ago, and it belonged, at the time, to a 14-year-old boy who did not yet have the words to say what he meant." The silence that followed was not sudden. It arrived He way weather arrives gradually, and then completely, settling over the porch, the garden, the slow brown river beyond it, until the only sound left in the world seemed to be the water moving over stone. Elias Warren's hands, resting on the arms of his chair, began, very slightly, to tremble. It was not the tremor of age. It was the tremor of a man encountering, after 2 centuries of quietly refusing to let himself hope for it, proof that something he had done once, in a corridor full of dying strangers, had mattered. "The boy," Elias said, his voice had gone rough, the one from the ancestral voice. "Yes. He stopped, started again. "You're the emperor." "I am also," the Kaelen said, and for the first time in the conversation his composure, the composure of a man who had addressed parliaments and buried 3 wives and governed 11,000 worlds without once, in 200 years, publicly losing command of his own voice, began, visibly, to come apart. The boy who was 14 years old and certain he was about to die on a maintenance deck beside a woman who had already given her life to buy me 30 more seconds. I remember every second of those 4 minutes, Sergeant Warren. I have remembered them every day for 211 years. I built a reign around them. I do not believe I would have become a man capable of ruling with any mercy at all if you had not first shown me that mercy was possible from people who had every reason in that moment to withhold it from me. Elias did not stand, his legs, by then, did not reliably permit standing without assistance, but he reached out one hand, weathered and spotted with 2 centuries of sun, and the Emperor of 11,000 worlds crossed the last few steps of a 19-day, several thousand light-year journey to take it. I looked for you, Elias said quietly. After the tribunal, I asked once whether the boy had made it home safe. They told me it wasn't my business to ask. I let it go. I told myself that was enough, that he'd made it home, and that was the whole of what I needed to know. It was not enough for me, the Emperor said. It has never been enough. Elias studied him for a long moment, the way an old man studies someone carrying a grief he recognizes because he has carried versions of it himself. You've lost people, he said. It was not a question. 3 wives, the Emperor said. 2 of my own children before their time. Every friend I had before the throne, and most of the ones I made after it, because a Kaelen who lives 4 centuries outlives nearly everyone who is not also fortunate enough to live that long. I have become very well acquainted with graves, Sergeant Warren. I did not expect, when I set out 19 days ago, that I would be adding another to the list I carry. But I find now that I would rather add it in person, having held your hand once more, than receive the report of it from an intelligence officer the way I so nearly did. I buried 2 wives myself, Elias said quietly. Different reasons, different griefs, but I know the shape of what you're describing. I always figured the extra years were just my body being stubborn, never once thought to ask why. Would you have wanted to know sooner? Elias considered this with the unhurried care he seemed to bring to every question, turning it over the way he might have turned over a stone pulled from the riverbed, checking its weight before deciding what to make of it. No, he said finally, I don't think I would have. A gift you know is a gift is fine, but a gift you don't know is a gift, that's just called a life. I got to live mine without wondering every morning whether I deserved the extra time I'd been given. I think that was probably the kinder version, even if it wasn't the honest one. I chose the kinder version over the honest one for 200 years, the Emperor admitted. I am only now discovering that I do not entirely know how to forgive myself for how long I let that choice stand unspoken. And let me make it easy, Elias said, and for the first time since the Emperor's arrival, something like his old soldier's steadiness came fully back into his voice. You're forgiven, not because you need my permission and not because it was some enormous crime you need absolving of. You're forgiven because what you did was kind, and kindness doesn't need forgiving. It just needs saying out loud eventually so the person who did it can stop carrying it alone. So there, said, done. Put it down, Emperor. You've carried it long enough. The Emperor closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, something in his posture had visibly eased, the particular unclenching of a man who has just set down a weight he had grown so accustomed to carrying that he had nearly forgotten it was a choice to keep carrying it at all. And then, without any further formality, without the 11 discarded speeches, without the language of THR, ones or debts or the particular grammar the Kaelen reserve for gratitude too large for ordinary words, the Emperor knelt on the porch steps of a small house on a forgotten river, and put his arms around a dying old man, and held him the way he had, once, 211 years earlier, been held in return by a thermal blanket and a stranger's steady voice telling him he was safe now, that no one was going to hurt him, that it was over. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was, by then, nothing that needed saying that had not already been said in the silence itself, in the weight of 200 years pressed into a single embrace, in the small, involuntary sound Elias Warren made against the shoulder of an alien emperor, the sound of a man discovering, very late in a long and quiet life, that the one thing he had done without expecting any reward had in fact reshaped the fate of two entire species, and that someone had remembered. Someone had never stopped remembering. Down at the spaceport, the six-person crew of the Ancestral Debt, for that was the name they had quietly given the small transport ship somewhere around day 9, without ever telling their passenger, though he had, of course, noticed and said nothing, watched the settlement's few residents gather at a respectful distance from the house, drawn by instinct rather than instruction, sensing without being told that something significant was happening on that porch. Something that deserved witnesses, even if it did not want an audience. The Emperor stayed on Halden's Rest for 11 days. He did not summon aides, did not conduct affairs of state, did not, for the better part of nearly 2 weeks, behave as anything other than an old friend visiting an older one. He sat on the porch each morning while Elias explained the shapes of the local weather clouds, the high, thin ones that meant clear skies through midday, the low gray bellies that meant the river would rise by evening, and listened each evening while the old man told stories about wives long buried and children who had grown up and moved to farther colonies, stories about the boat under the lean-to, built over 11 winters with his own hands and never sold despite 3 separate offers because, as Elias put it, some things you make aren't for selling, they're just for having made. The Emperor said very little himself during those days because he had come. He told Vosik quietly on the 4th night, not to be heard but to listen, to finally give this man, after 2 centuries, an audience for the parts of his life no one else had ever thought important enough to ask about. He has never told anyone the full account of what happened on that ship, Vosik observed one evening, as they walked back toward the small guest quarters the settlement had hastily arranged. Not even his own children, it seems. "I know," the Emperor said. "I asked him why on the 2nd night." "And what did he say?" "He said that a story like that, told too often, starts to feel like something you're using rather than something you lived. He said he'd rather it stayed small and true than became large and useful." The Emperor was quiet for a moment. "I have spent 2 centuries making it enormously, publicly useful, Vosik. I have built policy and doctrine and the entire architecture of my reign on those 4 minutes, and until this week, I never once asked the man at the center of them whether he wanted that weight placed on his shoulders. Does he mind it?" "No," the Emperor said, and something like wonder entered his voice. He said it was the finest thing anyone had ever done with something he gave away for free. On the 7th day, Elias asked the question that had apparently been sitting beneath every other conversation since the Emperor's arrival. "Why now?" he said. "Why not 50 years ago? 100? You've had 200 years to come, and I do understand, why an emperor can't simply leave his throne to visit an old soldier. But why now specifically?" The Emperor was quiet for a moment, watching the river. "Because for 200 years," he said finally, "I told myself the throne needed me more than you did. I told myself that was wisdom, that was duty, that was the correct calculation for a man responsible for 11,000 worlds." He turned to look at Elias directly. "And then, 6 days ago, my intelligence division informed me that you were dying, and I discovered, in the space of about 4 seconds, that every one of those 200 years of correct calculations had been a very sophisticated way of being a coward." Elias did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was gentler than it had been in the whole conversation. "You're not a coward," he said. "You built something extraordinary, 2 species that tried to kill each other, sharing rivers now, sharing children. I've read what news reaches out this far. I know what you built. That's not the work of a coward." "Perhaps not," the Emperor said, "but I built all of it while telling myself that coming here could wait, and it could not in the end wait. It very nearly did not happen at all." He paused. "I am an old man too, Sergeant Warren, by the measure of my own people, though not so old as I appear beside you now. I have perhaps another century left in me if I am fortunate. I have spent most of the centuries I have already had governing wisely, I hope. I did not want to spend the ones remaining without once, in person, having told you what those 4 minutes meant. I did not want you to die not knowing. I knew, Elias said quietly. I want you to understand that. I never doubted it mattered. I just never expected, he gestured, a small, tired motion at the man beside him, at the modest ship parked politely out of sight at the edge of the settlement, at the whole improbable weight of an emperor crossing a galaxy to sit on a porch. I never expected this. That, the emperor said, is precisely why it was necessary. They spent the middle days of the visit in quieter registers, the emperor asking on the 9th morning whether Elias would teach him to read the clouds himself, and Elias laughing, a real laugh, thin but genuine, the first Vosik had heard from him since their arrival, before patiently walking the emperor of 11,000 worlds through the difference between a cloud that meant rain by dusk and one that meant nothing at all. It was, Vosik noted privately in a journal he would not publish for another 40 years, the strangest and most moving lesson he had ever witnessed. A ruler who had negotiated the terms of galactic peace treaties sitting cross-legged on a porch step, utterly absorbed in the difference between two shades of gray in an alien sky. On the 12th morning, the ancestral debt prepared to depart. Elias' condition had not worsened during the visit. If anything, something in him seemed, for those 11 days, to have steadied, the way a candle sometimes burns a little longer and a little brighter in a room where someone has finally opened a window. But both men understood, without needing to say it aloud, that this was very likely the only visit there would be. At the base of the porch steps, the emperor turned back one final time. I have one more thing to tell you, he said. Something I have kept from you for 200 years, out of a fear that you would refuse it if I told you while you were strong enough to argue. Elias raised an eyebrow, the old sharpness flickering briefly back into his tired eyes. That sounds like a confession. It is. The emperor's voice was steady, but something behind it had softened into something almost apologetic. The health you have enjoyed across 2 centuries, the years that let you outlive 2 wives, teach 3 generations of children, build a boat with your own 2 hands, sit on this porch far longer than any human of your original era had any right to expect, was not entirely luck, Sergeant. It was a gift, delivered so quietly you were never meant to notice it as anything but good fortune. Kaelen medicine, folded into your water supply for nearly 180 years, on my order, under a project name my own physicians still use without knowing its origin. He paused. I did not tell you, because I did not want you to spend your extra years feeling indebted to a boy you had already saved without asking anything in return. I wanted you to simply live. I hope now, at the very end of it, that you can forgive the deception and understand it for what it actually was. Elias absorbed this in silence for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick. 2 extra wives, he said. 2 extra generations of kids I got to watch grow up. 50 extra years of river mornings I wasn't supposed to have. He shook his head slowly. You're asking me to forgive you for that. I am asking, yes. There's nothing to forgive, Elias said. You gave an old soldier a longer life than he ever expected and never once asked him to know it, let alone thank you for it. That's not a debt, Emperor. That's not even close to a debt. That's just, his voice caught. That's just what family does, even the kind of family nobody planned for. The Emperor did not trust himself to answer that immediately. When he finally did, his voice carried the particular weight of a man who has, after 2 centuries of formal address, run entirely out of formal things to say. Then let me say only this, he said. Thank you, not for the 4 minutes on the ancestral voice, though I am grateful for those beyond any measure I can express. Thank you for every year since in which you lived quietly, taught children to read the weather, buried the people you loved, and never once used what you had done to demand anything from anyone. You could have told your story. You could have made yourself famous, made yourself rich, made yourself powerful on the string. of having once saved an emperor's life. You never did. You simply lived a decent, unremarkable life, and in doing so proved every single day for 200 years that the mercy you showed me in that corridor was not an anomaly. It was simply who you are. That, Sergeant Warren, is the rarest thing I have encountered in 2 centuries of rule, and I did not want to leave this galaxy or let you leave it without telling you so plainly at least once. Elias Warren, 90 pounds lighter than he had been in his soldiering years, too weak by then to stand unassisted, reached out one more time, and the Emperor took his hand and held it, and neither man said anything further, because there was, by then, genuinely nothing left that needed saying. Elias Warren died 4 months later in the early spring, with the river running high outside his window and a Kaelen physician, quietly stationed on Halden's Rest at the Emperor's order, ostensibly as a colonial health liaison. At his bedside, along with 2 of his grandchildren and a letter, delivered by courier 3 days earlier, that he had asked to be read aloud to him one final time before the end. The letter was short. It did not use the language of emperors or thrones. It read in its entirety, "The garden looks the same in every memory I have kept of it. I intend to keep those memories exactly as they were, for as long as I have left to keep anything at all. Thank you for the last 4 minutes, just as I thanked you once for the first 4. Rest now. The river will keep running, so will everything you built without ever meaning to build it." News of his death reached the Emperor 11 days later, carried by a courier ship that had been quietly stationed at Halden's Rest for exactly this purpose. He did not hold a state ceremony. Elias had specifically, in a letter of his own written during that final visit, asked that none be held, that he be allowed to remain, in death as in life, an unremarkable man in an unremarkable place. The Emperor honored that request exactly, with one single exception. He ordered a modest stone marker placed beside the grave, inscribed not with rank or title, but with a single line in both standard English and formal Kaelen script, a line that historians would spend the following decades trying, and largely failing, to properly translate, because the Kaelen phrase it mirrored carried a weight no human word quite captured. A phrase used in Kaelen tradition to mark not merely gratitude, but a debt so foundational that it had, in the end, reshaped the character of an entire civilization. The rough translation, the one that eventually made its way into common use across both human and Kaelen space, read simply, "He held out empty hands, and a galaxy learned what mercy could build." The Emperor visited the grave only once more in his own lifetime, some 30 years later, quietly, without ceremony, on a journey his official schedule listed only as "Private Matters, Colonial Sector." He stood beside the marker for a long time, said nothing that anyone present recorded, and left a single stone from the palace gardens at its base, a small, unremarkable gray stone, indistinguishable from any other, except that it had sat, for 2 centuries, on the windowsill of the room where a 14-year-old boy had once slept safely for the first time since a stranger's empty hands had told him he no longer had anything left to fear. The story of the visit itself did not stay private for long, despite every effort made to keep it that way. A member of the Settlement Council on Halden's Rest, moved by what she had witnessed on that porch and unable, in good conscience, to let it disappear into the general silence the Emperor had requested, wrote a modest account of the 11 days for a small colonial newsletter some years later, after both men involved were gone, and she judged the story finally safe to tell without disturbing anyone's peace. It was picked up, reprinted, translated into 40 Kaelen dialects and every major human language within a decade, and became, eventually, one of the defining stories of the era, not because it involved an emperor, though that certainly helped it travel, but because of what people on both sides of the old war found themselves recognizing in it. Veterans who had fought in that brief, brutal conflict, the dwindling few who were still alive to read it, wrote letters to newspapers and public broadcasts describing their own small, unremarkable moments of mercy shown, or received during the fighting, moments they had never before considered worth mentioning, buried under decades of assuming that only the worst parts of a war were the parts worth remembering. Teachers on both human and Kaelen worlds began including the story in age-appropriate versions in curricula about the war's end, not as the official cause of the peace. The peace had 1,000 causes, most of them far less romantic, but as a way of explaining to children who would never know a galaxy without the partnership their ancestors had built, why that partnership had been worth building in the first place. Historians, predictably, argued about it for generations. Some insisted the story had been embellished in the retelling, that no single act of mercy could plausibly explain 2 centuries of policy, that the truth was messier and more institutional than any one soldier and any one boy. They were, in the dry, careful way historians are usually right about such things, almost certainly correct. The peace between humanity and the Kaelen Ascendancy was built by thousands of hands, over decades, through treaties and compromises, and the unglamorous daily labor of diplomats and administrators, whose names appear in no popular retelling at all. But even the most skeptical historians tended to concede, when pressed, that stories like this one matter regardless of how neatly they explain the larger history around them, that a civilization needs sometimes a single image small enough to hold in the mind and the heart at once, a picture it can return to when the abstractions of policy and treaty start to feel too distant to explain why any of it was worth doing. An emperor kneeling on a porch, an old soldier's trembling hand, 4 minutes in a dying ship, and 200 years of a debt neither man ever tried to collect. The house on Halden's Rest still stands today, maintained by a rotating trust of local volunteers, and in later years, by a modest endowment the Ascendancy quietly established without ever attaching its own name to it. The garden is kept deliberately a little wild, the way Elias always kept it. The boat still sits under its lean-to, repaired when it needs repairing, never sold, never moved, exactly as its builder intended. Visitors come, now, in numbers the original settlement could never have imagined, some out of historical curiosity, some out of something closer to pilgrimage, and most of them, by every account kept by the volunteers who tend the place, leave saying some version of the same thing. That they came expecting a monument to an emperor, and left having found, instead, a monument to the quiet, unglamorous, entirely ordinary decency of one man who happened, once, to be standing in the right corridor with his hands empty and his mind already made up. If you have ever waited years, not months, not weeks, but years, to see someone who mattered to you more than you ever properly told them while you had the chance, then you already understand exactly what that old soldier felt on his porch, and exactly what that emperor felt kneeling on the steps beside him. Some debts are not meant to be repaid. They are meant to be carried quietly for as long as it takes, until the moment finally comes to set them down in person, hands empty, nothing held back. Somewhere out there, right now, there is probably someone you would cross a galaxy for, if a galaxy was what stood between you. Most of us will never be asked to prove it with a journey of 19 days and several thousand light years. Most of us will only be asked to pick up a phone, or write a letter, or simply show up. If this story reminded you of someone like that, go find them. Don't wait 200 years to say what you mean.